When we are designing the syllabus for future semester, me like many of my colleagues, right, we look for dates that will match, the lab exam will not conflict with the class exam and so on. And there's some specific dates you don't want to give your exam, right? After the Duke game, the championship game or something like that. You prefer, if you can, not to do that. 1 year, I don't know why I missed that, and I put an exam, a midterm, the day after Halloween. Now, nobody said a word, and I didn't even know that. And then a week before the exam, I got a very, very nice and polite email from one of my students that said, I completely understand that the academic affairs come before anything else, but is it even possible? Maybe you want to reconsider the situation. And I looked at myself and said, shoot, I did not plan that. But at the same time, right, if now I change the exam, I could postpone the exam, but then it might be a conflict for one of the other students. So I did a poll, right? I used poll everywhere, the same idea as learning catalytics, the following day, and asked how many of you are good. And I said, if even one student has a problem with that, we're not going to postpone the exam. That was the first, only, and last time that I did a poll, which was 100%. 100%, I'm not kidding you, right? Then I said postpone, and we did that, so it can happen. Okay, so guys, speaking of Halloween, I have no idea actually how it's relevant to this, but this is why I asked you last time, okay? So I want to give you another, kind of like a minute, to refresh your memory. Now also after you read more about arteries and blood vessels, I want to present it again, and then so we can discuss this. So again, the idea is why elasticity is so important, and it's actually not just elasticity, but the ability of the arteries to expand, right? So we have expansion, and then we have elasticity, which means we're not collapsing, but we're just recoiling to the resting state. So let's take one scenario. These are two separate scenarios. One, these are like plastic or metal tubes, pipes. They cannot really expand. What can be a potential problem with this? How would that affect the cardiovascular system? In a completely different scenario, instead of a metal pipes, think about them as balloons. Like after you take out the air, right, the balloon collapses completely. What can that lead to? So again, talk with each other, I'll give you a minute, and then we'll see why elasticity is so important. Guys, to think about the first part, I put it here so we can use the graph to answer this question. So, first part, the problem is not, we're not talking about elasticity, but about distensibility, the idea of being able to expand. So, what would happen if they were not able to do it? Anyone want to suggest discussions? Can I give it a shot? You give a great answer to me. Yeah, if you're okay with that.
I said that if it wasn't elastic, then when the blood is working through it, it wouldn't be able to control it.
If it goes like this and it gets all the blood, remember she said something about pressure.
Right, the blood pressure would be too high if it wasn't able to stay in place.
Exactly. Right now, the aorta and the large arteries, right, if you're sitting in the walls of the aorta and large arteries, you'll get hit by 120 millimeters of mercury. That's a lot. But you get it. You absorb the pressure. But if you had not, then all the blood will run all the way, right, to the tissues. So what happens if you sit in the capillary right now? Right now, you're getting the 15 millimeters or so of mercury. What would happen if you're getting hit, not by maybe 120, because there will still be friction, but let's say by 80 or 90? What can be a problem? Are the capillaries adjusted structurally for that? No, the capillaries don't have all the layers that the aorta and the large arteries have, because they have their own function, and function follows form. What we need in the capillaries is the thinnest layer we can imagine, so diffusion will take place efficiently. We don't have all the elastic fibers, we don't have so many connective tissues, we just have a very thin layer of epithelial cells because we need that for diffusion. Elastic arteries have all the connective tissues, so they can expand. And this is why one of the terms we give, or one of the names that we give the elastic arteries are also the pressure or blood pressure reservoir. Okay, think about a reservoir like a lake that holds the water so we can distribute it later, right? But not all the water go into the pipes, right? Here in this area, most of our water comes from the Ho River, but it's not coming from the Ho River directly to my sink, right? It goes to Jordan Lake. So the Jordan Lake is the reservoir. In some lakes to different other places, the same thing goes here. So that's a pressure reservoir. It can hold and absorb some of the pressure later to distribute the water. Emma? Yes, the same. The heart is just pushing the same 120 millimeters of mercury.
Okay, so the pressure built up in the arteries can't prevent blood flow.
Exactly. So Emma is asking, the pressure that is developing in the arteries is preventing. It's not so much preventing, it's just, in a way, it's preventing some, and it's slowing down the rest of the part. Again, just think about it as a lake. Instead of putting everything from the river to your, right, to your tap, to your faucet, is going to the lake and distributed later on, later on, later on. That's the idea. So if you go back to where we saw that here, right, we said that the aorta and the arteries expand and store pressure in the elastic arteries. They are the pressure reservoir. Do not confuse that with the volume reservoir. They're not the blood volume reservoir. Anyone knows where the blood volume reservoir is? Where do we find most of the blood? In the veins, exactly. But there's not a big issue of pressure in the veins, right? Because this is already after a lot of frictions taking place. So most of our blood volume-wise is found in the veins, but most of the blood pressure-wise is found in the large arteries. Keep that question for just a second, okay? Okay, so that's the first advantage we have by having this distensibility. So let's talk about the elasticity. What would happen if they were like balloons? Balloons can expand, right? But they collapse after the blood is out or the air is out in the balloon. What's problematic with that? When the blood will be pushed, what will be the consequence? First of all, we have an issue of backflow, and we want to keep that backflow, right? We want to keep the blood in the area. What would be the pressure, the local pressure in the arteries if we had a balloon-like arteries during diastole? It would be zero, right? Because we just ejected the blood, so we're collapsing. So we will have to play between 120 to a zero. We will have to build up all the time a lot of pressure. Instead, with the elasticity, with the ability of the elastic to recoil with the elastic arteries, what we do, we play with a much, much smaller window between 120 and 80 millimeters. So all you need to do, if your heart, if you the left ventricle, is to push blood in such a way that the 80 will go up to 120. You don't need to rebuild everything from scratch, which is much easier. Yes? The blood, if I do not absorb the pressure, the next set of blood vessels will get higher pressure. Because capillaries will burst. Yes, exactly. It will burst open or torn apart. Or even if not just that, it will just not be efficient enough because, again, think about the river going directly to your tap. You will not be able to do whatever you need to do because everything will be just a huge stream. Okay. So let's go back to our graph, and to remind us all, we have these fluctuations, right? Now, when we do math and physics, we don't like to talk about different variables when we talk about a given thing like pressure. So to help us, and this is not just in the scientific manner or way, but also in the clinical aspect, right? We want to look for a determinant that will kind of like put the systolic and the diastolic together. And this is what we call the MAP, the mean arterial pressure. So we said that they fluctuate between diastole and systole. The mean arterial pressure is the mean between systolic and diastolic pressures. Now, the mean arterial pressure is the pressure in the large arteries, right? To measure in the large arteries. And we said that this is the highest. So this is the starting point, and in a way the driving force, because remember, blood moves because of the gradient of pressure, right? So the mean arterial pressure, in other words, is the systemic blood pressure. So we have the mean arterial pressure, we can call it the arterial blood pressure, we can call it the systemic blood pressure. They are all the same. To be more accurate, what we should say is that the systemic blood pressure is the mean arterial pressure minus 0. But because it's minus 0, because that's at the end of the road of the system, we don't need to do the minus 0, so we just say the mean arterial pressure is the pressure that runs the blood. By the way, for those of you who took calculus 1, maybe a little bit above, what's the mean between 120 and 80? What's the mean? What's the average between 120 and 80? If you need calculators, you can do that on an Excel sheet or something. What is it? It's 100, but the mean arterial pressure, that's the line, the solid line, and it's more like 90 something, 96, 97. How come? Don't they know the math? They know, they do. So why 97 or 96? Why not 100? What's wrong with them? Time of what? Exactly. The diastole expands for a longer time. We have more diastole than we have systole in the cardiac cycle, therefore it contributes more to the mean. It's not exactly in the middle. Okay, a question for you, and we'll come back to the mean arterial pressure when we try to think about numbers. We'll talk about Bob. Okay, that's Bob. By the way, this guy name is Little Bob. I got this as a gift when I left my lab here and started my current position, and the PI, the researcher of the lab, is called Bob Goldstein. So just to make sure we're not confusing, this is Little Bob. That was Big Bob. That's our third Bob. Okay? So here's Bob. Bob for a long time was unemployed, looked for a job, and finally found a great job. He's a doorman in a hotel. Everybody's really, really nice. Customers, the management, his colleagues. He is a very nice person, amiable person, and now he has the ability to say welcome and smile, to get some nice tips. He's a happy Bob until it comes to the evening when he comes back. Because when he comes back, okay, his ankles are swollen, okay, swollen filled with fluids, and what we're trying to understand and what's going on here, okay? So let's do this learning catarrhs. Basically, why are those ankles swollen? What makes his ankles swollen? Let's hear, yes?
I was thinking there might be some sort of like failure with the right side of his heart, because if the right side was not keeping up with the left, then he'd likely have some sort of backup.
Great creative answer. Bob's heart is perfect. He has one of the best hearts you can imagine. Okay, but a good creative answer. Yes?
Blood flows up your legs to your heart, and if you're sitting for so long, gravity resists that.
Okay, so we have gravity here, right? Now, in order for blood to move from point A to point B, we said that we need to have a what? Blank of pressure? A gradient, right? Do we have, so this is after the arteries, right? And after the capillaries, when we go to the veins now, and we're going to talk about the veins a bit. Let's go back for a second to our graph. Okay, so do we have a gradient between this part, the venules, all the way to the right atrium? Do we have a gradient? We do. Otherwise, blood will not flow. But this is not a gradient like the gradient we used to have here, right? This is a bit less of a gradient. And the problem when it comes to the lower limbs is now gravity is really playing a part, right? It's hydrostatic pressure, so it's a challenge. And we need to help. Basically what we need is to help the veins propel the blood all the way up to the heart. Not a big deal when it comes to the pulmonary circulation, but a big deal when it comes to the systemic circulation and our limbs, and especially the extremes of our limbs, right? Now, He's standing, so he's not moving, and we'll see why moving can help us. But first of all, what is the swelling thing? If you do not push enough blood back to the heart, you will push blood to the heart, right? He's not dying, but just not as much as he should. Then you have accumulation of blood in your lower limbs. Blood is mainly made of water, right? And water at some point will go and leave the capillaries all the way to the interstitial fluids, to the ECFs, and what we'll get is swelling. Anyone knows how we call this? This is edema. That was not us, so. Okay, so let's go back here. So what we have is edema. Less blood is coming back to the heart, which means too much is staying in the lower limbs, which means blood overflows towards the connective tissues, which means, and the ECF mainly, which means that we have edema, we have swelling. And we see that if we're not moving, if we're doing shopping, or like a long day of shopping, right? Many of you, shopping involves a lot of like standing, right? You're buying shoes or something like that, right? And you're finding your perfect shoes, and the night you come home and you see, oh, I cannot even put the shoes because my ankles are swelling. Yeah, I think everyone had this experience, right? So why is moving? I mean, when we're moving, we're not contracting our smooth muscles, and that's not the issue. We are, however, contracting what? A skeletal muscle. And that's one, not the only, but one of the wonderful mechanisms that help the blood being propelled along the veins. So we'll talk about two of these solutions or adjustment or adaptations. Again, function follows form. There are more than two. Okay? So again, the challenge here is in the veins. From about 15 millimeters to 0, that's not a lot of gradient. So how do we do that? We have a great anatomy for that. Our blood vessels are embedded within, are enwrapped by our skeletal muscles. Okay? So, and when I say blood vessels, I mean the veins. So the veins, as they move here, what they have in this case, the gastrocnemius, the soleus, are basically enwrapping them. So when you are contracting those muscles, what do? You squeeze the blood, basically. You milk the blood, if you will, right? And you push it. But it can go both ways if you push it. So what's the second mechanism? Second, the fact that we have valves. They are very similar to the valves we find in the heart. They are one-way valves. So the blood cannot move backwards. It can only move forwards. So these are the two mechanisms. The valves prevent the backflow, and the contraction of the muscles milk the blood towards the heart. Does this answer a question that we have, or something that we discussed when we talk about regulation of the heart? That's like when we do exercise, for example. What happens when we exercise? What did we say happens? We have an increased what? I want to hear the term. When we exercise, we increase the what? Start with a V. The venous return, right? And that increases the V, and that increases the preload and everything that we discussed. When we exercise, of course, our muscles contract a lot, right? So we squeeze that blood even better than we typically do. That increases the venous return, increasing the cardiac output and everything that we discussed. So one of the ways to increase venous return. Any questions about this challenge, about the valves? Yes, here.
Does movement and like movement's role in preventing edema also have to do with the fact that when you're moving?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Right. Does the role or like the relationship between edema and movement have anything to do with the fact that when you're moving, you are like increasing your heart rate and like?
Is the edema correlated as well to the heart rate as is increased? Yeah, is that the question? I mean, you might have more blood in certain areas, but if you have a normal circulation, an effective circulation, this will not result in edema, basically. If you have a lot, when I say a lot, I mean a lot of extra fluids, that will also have an effect on edema. Okay, yes, Livia. if you are a bodybuilder and you put a lot of strength or challenge on your blood vessels, not necessarily. They are, protected. I want to say that there's no, injuries like in any sports, right? You'll have potential injuries, but not that I know of just regular weightlifting. Not that I know. Maybe there is something I'm not familiar with. Okay, so we summarized, we compared and contrasted structures, and we talked about the determinants, but let's go back to the determinants and talk about the three factors that basically affect our vascular system. This formula or equation that you see here applies not just for our story. It applies to airflow, it applies to water flow in the river, it applies to gases even, right? So what do we have here? We have flow equals pressure divided by resistance. Meaning that the greater the resistance, the what? The flow? Lower or higher? Lower, right? And that makes a lot of sense. So let's define those determinants. Flow is the volume of blood. And when I say blood, I mean it can be blood running through a small vessel, a large vessel, an organ, or the entire circulation. It doesn't have just to have be systemic circulation. It can be any point A to point B. That formula applies to all of the flow. P applies, the pressure applies in this case to blood pressure, right? To the gradient of blood pressure. And we talked about what pressure is quite a bit. It's the force per unit area exerted on the wall of a blood vessel by its contained blood. And resistance comes from what? We talked about that. Friction, right? So let's see. Resistance, the opposition to flow, measure of the amount of friction the blood encounters. The more it encounters, the more it moves. The more friction it encounters, the greater the resistance. Again, this is an equation that runs for any, if I ask you a question about a given artery, and then the flow from one point to the other point, all of these apply. But we are focused here on the systemic circulation. So let's see how we can, if we are familiar with those determinants in different names. Okay? So let's think about the systemic circulation. If at the systemic level, let's think about, and I should go back for a second and just remind you, this is important. It's the volume of blood flowing through a vessel at a given period. So we have a rate in this determinant, right? It's per minute or whatever time you give it. So at the systemic level, are we familiar with the term for the blood flow, the volume of blood that runs in the whole system per minute? How do we call it? We know the name. Think about it for a second, and I'm going to count to 3. But think about it for a second, or consult. Let's see. What's a flow in the system at the systemic level? 1, 2, 3. Cardiac output. Not stroke volume? No, because it's stroke volume, but we have the time, right? The rate. So it's the cardiac output. What about pressure? Are we familiar with the pressure at the systemic level? How do we call the pressure at the systemic level? It's blood pressure or systemic blood pressure. Another term for that? Something with 3 letters. MAP, right? The mean arterial pressure. We just discussed it. And resistance, it's the sum of all the resistances in our systemic. We call it peripheral resistance. So instead of finding blood flow equals pressure divided by resistance, we'll just call it the systemic level with terms that we are familiar with already. Cardiac output equals MAP divided by peripheral resistance. Again, it's a sum of all the resistances of all the blood vessels, the 60,000 miles of blood vessels. Any questions so far? Lucy, can you guys put the skeleton here and you can come out? You don't have problems seeing that, right? Okay. For those who we're not on our Facebook, we have some, right? If we mentioned Lucy, right? Tuesday. When is that time of yours specifically? 3:30. 3:30. Honors thesis. We have 4 students. Most of our students, the graduating seniors, are doing it in the spring, so in the fall it's always a bit less. And we typically have about 30. Now we have 4 excellent students going to present the thesis, our own Lucy. Okay? Let's give you some applause. Okay, so really, just come and join, it's going to be wonderful. So, questions? Okay, so let's talk about the factors that affect circulation and pressure with these ones. First of all, let's think about this equation. Basically, whatever you change, whichever factor you change will affect the others, right? One will go up, one will go down, but it's 3, it's not just 2. So anyone that you'll change, another one might change. And when we think about the body and we think about physiology, we always think about homeostasis, right? So in a way, in a very simplistic manner, I can just ask, which one is more important to keep constant? All of the 3 are important. But body-wise, which one, if I need to change the determinants to make sure that one is under homeostasis, which one would you choose? I mean, all of them are important, right? Which one, if you mess up with it, will prevent the blood from flowing at all, or from flowing too much? The pressure. The pressure is the driving force for blood to flow. Okay, so we just defined the determinants. This is the next place, the next set of learning objectives. We'll come back to this. Right now, we'll talk about the blood pressure. So the MAP is the driving force for blood to flow. We need to keep it somewhat constant. Constant is not meaning static. We need to make sure that it's in a window, the proper window. If it's going to be too low, we won't have enough driving force for proper blood flow. Right? If it's instead of 100, if the MAP is instead of 90 plus, let's say 70, that will flow, but just not enough to supply the demands, right? If it's too high, then it will damage the walls, not of the aorta and the large arteries. They are okay, but the smaller arteries, arterioles, and definitely the capillaries. So everything that will work when it comes to homeostasis will work around, let's make sure that the MAP is okay. It's kind of constant. So we can take this equation, where is it, right? And instead of writing it this way, maybe we're going to go put MAP on the left. So MAP will equal what? Cardiac output, what? Times peripheral resistance, right? We're just writing it in a different manner. And now we'll see how we can control and what we can change. And I'm using another diagram, again the same type of engineering-based or sewer-based water pipe system. But this time we're going to talk more about big picture because we don't care about each and every arterial. So here is one large artery representing all the aorta and the large arteries. This one represents the arterioles. And we don't care right now about the whole heart, we care just about the left ventricle, because cardiac output is the volume ejected by the left ventricle to the system at a given minute. Okay? So basically, if we want to change MAP, yes, Nicole, before we start. In resistance, we talk about the friction exerted on the blood as it encounters, as it moves, yes. We're talking about friction. So if for some reason our MAP is, let's say, too low, okay, for some reason, then we can either increase cardiac output and or, it's not just or, they're not mutually exclusive, increase the resistance, right? That's the idea, to think as you are the body trying to reach homeostasis. So if MAP is too low, we can increase cardiac output and or resistance and to increase MAP. Now we can do both, and we can do it in different ways. Cardiac output, you know, we have stroke volume, we have a heart rate. Resistance, we'll see we can affect in so many ways, but generally the moment to moment, the more acute response will be through resistance. That's the short-term response. Okay, so if we want, for example, to increase pressure, because the pressure is too low, we are going to increase resistance. So we want to talk about resistance, and first of all about the 3 factors that can affect resistance, or origins of resistance. 2 of them are important, but they're pretty static. You can't change them moment to moment. The third one you can. So the first one is the viscosity of the blood. How viscous, how thick the blood is. If you drink water, or if you drink a smoothie with a straw, Where do you find more resistance? What is harder to drink? Smoothie, right? Because it's more viscous. Same thing goes for the blood. Where is that viscosity coming from? From the components of the blood that are not water, and mainly the most abundant one, which are the red blood cells. So the more red blood cells you have, the more viscous the blood is. Is there going to be a huge factor? No. But it can happen. If you synthesize more red blood cells, you contribute to resistance. A good example for that would be with these crazy athletes that go every year to the Tour de France, and not just the Tour de France, but they go up to the Alps, okay, and exercise heavily, right? They really challenge themselves. Now, I think most of you are familiar with the fact that as you go up, right, in heights, basically the pressure is going lower, right? Less oxygen. There are different adjustments that the body will do, but the very first adjustment would be to make more red blood cells. The basic idea is I don't have a lot of oxygen to provide the blood, so let me make sure that I have as many red blood cells as possible, so whatever I have, I immediately transfer. Okay? I have less product, so I'm just going to make sure I have enough trucks to carry that product as most efficiently as I can possibly do. Now, of course, in weeks you have different biochemical adjustments, and that's exactly what those athletes will do. They will come weeks before the actual race starts, but in the beginning, that's going to be the adjustment. So what will happen to the blood pressure, to the systemic blood pressure of those athletes in the first days of the adjustment? Will it increase or decrease? Think about it a little bit. Think about resistance, red blood cells. Increase or decrease? Increase. Why? Because they are making more red blood cells to adjust, to fix the problem with oxygen, right? As a result, they increase the resistance because the blood becomes more viscous, less watery, more viscous. And that's increasing peripheral resistance, which means it also increases NAP. Okay? Now, this is not a moment to moment, right? You don't go to the Alps and the next 5 minutes you go down and then another 5 minutes. So it is a factor that we need to acknowledge, but it's not how you change the heart pressure, the blood pressure at any given minute. The second fact is the mileage. We talked about the fact that the greater the mileage, the more friction, the more resistance, therefore the more blood pressure. Now, we're not changing the mileage of the blood pressure from moment to moment, but we are changing the mileage of blood pressure. Our blood system is not static. We branch more, we develop more blood vessels when needed. Anyone, how do we call this process of making more blood vessels? Anyone in biology, cell biology? Angiogenesis, right? And we do that. A good example, one, not the only, but one of the reasons why obesity is correlated with high blood pressure is because in obesity we have more fat in our fat cells. We need to supply more blood, to supply more nutrients, to get rid of more waste, basically. So we build up more mileage, more blood vessels to supply the demand. As a result, you have more mileage in the system, more resistance, more systemic blood pressure. The third factor is the factor that we can change from a moment to moment. And that factor is going to be what? It's going to be the radius. Because as we said, when we talked about arterioles and capillaries and arteries, the smaller the diameter, the more friction the blood will encounter. That is, the greater the resistance. So vessel diameter. And not only that the vessel diameter is inversely related with pressure, with resistance, but it's in the fourth power, which means that if you just change and decreased the radius, okay, this is the radius itself, in 2 millimeters, what was the effect on the resistance? Times what? 16. So it's huge, it's a dramatic effect. If you have, for example, low blood pressure, and now you are decreasing the radius, diameter, what did you do? Did you increase or decrease resistance? I want to hear all of you. Again, if I had this blood vessel, I decreased the radius, it's now smaller. Did I decrease or increase the resistance? Increase. If I increase the resistance, what's the effect on the systemic blood pressure? It's an increase. right? This is confusing if you think about it, because locally we said that, hey, we have more resistance, it's less pressure, but we're talking now about the effect on the system as a whole. Do not confuse local and systemic. Now we're talking systemic blood pressure. So how can I make a blood vessel smaller in diameter? We call it constriction. How can I constrict the blood vessel, vasoconstrict it? How do I do that mechanistically? Smooth muscles. Where would I find those smooth muscles mainly? In the arterioles, right? Remember, we have lots and lots of arterioles. So I can tell the smooth muscles in the blood vessels to contract. That will lead to constriction and to increase in blood pressure, systemic blood pressure. Here's a challenge for you. How can I tell, though, if you're not starting with constricted, but just a regular diameter, okay? And it's too high, it's too high for blood pressure, not so high is correct, okay? What do you want to do? Do you want, again, if you have a problem, the blood pressure is too high for whatever reason, okay? I want to decrease the blood pressure. What would I do? Would I constrict or dilate, expand? Dilate. If I dilate, less resistance, less pressure. You okay with that, first of all? The concept? Great. But if it's relaxed, how can I dilate it? It's not from constricting, it's from the resting state. Anyone knows? You see the problem? I can constrict something that is relaxed, but how can I dilate something that is relaxed? It's already relaxed. Anyone knows? The issue is with the resting state, okay? Do you remember when we talked about our skeletal muscles? We talked about the fact that our skeletal muscles are not really relaxed, right? We call this phenomenon with a name. How do we call it? The muscle tone. Our skeletal muscles are partially constricted, contracted in that case. The same thing goes for the smooth muscles of our arterioles. They're always partially contracted. Therefore, our blood vessels, our arterioles, are not really fully relaxed. They are a bit constricted. You can still constrict them more, but they're constricted some. We actually call it the vaso for blood vessels, motor tone, vasomotor tone. So constricting is a controlled mechanism to increase resistance and to increase systemic blood pressure, and dilating, the same thing for decreasing blood pressure. Any questions about this? We'll come back to the actual how we regulate this shortly, but at this point, just about the concept. Yes, Abby. Right.
Why is that? Because you increase the area that forces.
You don't increase the area, what you increase is the mileage. The question was about what happens with the mileage, with the length, right? So the more blood travels, remember we're talking about the systemic circulation, about the whole blood pressure. So the more blood travels, right, the more friction it will encounter, and that will increase the pressure. The local pressure at a given point might be lower, but the systemic pressure, the systemic resistance, and therefore the systemic pressure will increase. It's